Good day. The last couple of hours in Ukraine have witnessed more advances by Russian forces in Donbass. It's the kind of incremental advance that we've now seen in various periods of the fighting in Donbass. As I've said, the usual pattern is that the Russians advance in a particular sector. They then slow down as they come up against the very carefully prepared Ukrainian fortifications, which the topography of this region makes possible. They then carry out heavy artillery strikes on these fortifications, heavy artillery and missile strikes on the Ukrainian forces, which are involved both in defending these particular fortifications and providing the Ukrainian military with its operational reserve. And then eventually, once the ground has been softened, once smaller places, towns and settlements surrounding the main target of any particular attack have been cleared, once the roads have been cut, making resupply difficult, then, but not before, the main attack happens. And in fact, we've been hearing news about various settlements now coming under Russian control and of further strikes on Ukrainian forces in Donbass. Whilst I'm on the topic of the battle for Donbass, I should say that there's been a claimed details of a report by the Polish intelligence services have been leaked. I'm not sure how much value or veracity to put to all this information, but this supposed Polish intelligence report says that the condition of the Ukrainian army in Donbass is now very poor, that many of the best troops have been lost, but it also says that President Zelensky has given a categorical instruction that that the Ukrainian presence in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk must be defended at least until the end of August. This apparently being in order to keep the Western powers on side with Ukraine. That's consistent with some of the other rumours we've been hearing about why Ukraine is clinging on to Donbass in this fashion. Now, whilst the fighting continues in Donbass, lots of things are going on elsewhere. In Kharkov region, the Russians continue to move steadily towards Kharkov city, and there have now been ever heavier Russian missile strikes in and around Kharkov city and attacking various Ukrainian military formations there. But perhaps the more interesting pattern of the fighting is in southwest Ukraine. Now, over the course of my discussions in my previous video, I questioned whether a HIMARS missile would be sufficient to do serious damage to the dam across the Dnieper River, which is located in this area. And I also ventured the suggestion that it would be very difficult for a HIMARS system to do serious damage, one of these systems by itself to do serious damage to a bridge. Bridges not being especially easy items to destroy. Well, I've had some emails about this. One is from a correspondent who I've had before, who's previously and very eruditely discussed the HIMARS systems with me. And I've also had a discussion about the use of these HIMARS by another correspondent who has informed me that he had served in the Indian military. And essentially, I think this is not entirely unlike contradicts what I've said. As I said, I'm not a military person. I don't know a huge amount about the HIMARS system itself, but the consensus is that HIMARS missiles are not really suitable for attacking a dam. The sheer engineering resilience involved in a dam would make HIMARS systems basically unsuitable to destroy a dam. So I think this idea that the HIMARS system can do serious damage to this dam across the Dnieper River, that this would lead to heavy flood damage in this part of Ukraine, which might obstruct Russian communications. I think this is an exaggeration. I think that this was a misunderstanding. However, these correspondents both think that well-executed HIMARS strikes might succeed in doing damage to a bridge. Now, here I'm going to say that we've had a lot more reports about the Ukrainian missile strikes on the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson. And the first thing to say is that the Antonovsky Bridge has been attacked on 2 consecutive days, that the strikes which have been made have not been made by a single HIMARS, but by at least 12. 8 of these missiles have managed to penetrate the Russian defenses and have done damage to the bridge. The damage is not yet structural, or so it seems, but there is concern that if these attacks continue, then sooner or later the bridge will be damaged beyond repair. And that would complicate Russian resupply across this bridge to the areas to the Russian forces west of the Dnieper River. Now, I ought to say that we're also getting more reports now about the fact that the Ukrainians have concentrated their troops around Kryvyi Rog, and that some kind of Ukrainian offensive in this area now is expected. Now, I have to say that on the basis of what I've been reading and hearing at the moment, this offensive that the Ukrainians appear to be preparing along from south from Kryvyi Rog does seem to be on a somewhat smaller scale, in fact a significantly smaller scale than this gigantic epic advance of tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops that we've been hearing and reading so much about. It's beginning to look increasingly more like a local offensive rather than a major one. And of course the Russians have not been idle either. They've been launching missile strikes of considerably bigger scale than those that the Ukrainians have been carrying out, both against Ukrainian formations, military units in this area, and also against bridges. And they destroyed, or at least they seriously damaged, a Ukrainian bridge in Odessa across the Dniester River, which is, by the way, another big river in this area west of the Dnieper. So we can see that both sides are preparing the ground for what looks like an important battle in southwest Ukraine, as the Ukrainians prepare for this offensive, which now seems imminent, and the Russians prepare to counter this offensive. We shall see what happens. But in the meantime, we've had a whole succession of statements from Russian officials, from an official called Leonid Slutsky, who is a parliamentarian, from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and from Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, all of whom have been saying one and the same thing, that from this point on, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are going to result in tougher demands from Russia against Ukraine. And the tone of these statements suggests to me that the Russians think that they have the situation, at least in this part of Ukraine, fairly well in hand. Well, as I said, we shall see. We shall see how effective this Ukrainian offensive in this part of the world has been. When the Ukrainians have tried to launch offensives in this area in the past, they've not been very successful. But against that, perhaps it's fair to say that this offensive seems to have been rather better prepared than previous ones, and we've seen the HIMARS being used to damage and perhaps eventually destroy the Antonovsky Bridge. So that's where we are. I should say that another Russian official has also been busy. General Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, continues to inspect Russian forces in Donbass. As I've said previously, whatever offensive the Ukrainians may be planning in Kherson region, or at least in southwest Ukraine, the Russians also seem to be working hard to prepare what I suspect is going to be a much bigger offensive in Donbass and conceivably against Kharkov. So that's where we are with this situation at the moment. In the meantime, there's been some dismay in the West about this purge that President Zelensky is carrying out of officials in Ukraine, which I've discussed in previous programs. And there's also some rather curious rumors circulating that that there's been some kind of an assassination attempt against President Zelensky. Now, I want to say straight away, some of these rumors about this assassination attempt look to me fairly well sourced, but again, there's been no official confirmation that such an assassination attempt has indeed been made. And unless and until there is, I would park this rumor as just a rumor. I don't know that this is true, but what is true is that this purge has caused some concern in Western capitals about how stable the government system in Kiev really is. Well, that's where we are with that. Perhaps unsurprisingly, and we're going now back to that Polish intelligence report, we are hearing that there's been serious concern from some Western officials about the way in which Ukraine has been using some of these weapon systems that it's been provided. There's been particular irritation about Ukrainian misuse of the M777 howitzers, for example. And we also learn from the Ukrainian side that there are daily briefings provided by Ukraine to American and British officials explaining the course of the war and what is happening, what is being done with these weapons. So this all rather confirms the suspicion that the Western powers have been tightening their supervision of Ukraine and are increasingly taking steps to direct Ukrainian actions on the battlefield. And that's consistent with the previous reports that it's the Western powers that have been insisting that Ukraine stand and fight in Donbass. They've also, and it's consistent with other reports that it's the Western powers who have been insisting on this counteroffensive in Kherson region. Well, as I said, we'll see whether this micromanagement of Ukraine by Western officials based in Washington and London is really a substitute for actual decision making by Ukrainian commanders on the ground. Now, as all of this is going on, we're having more and more information pouring out from these very important talks which President Putin had with the Iranian leadership in Tehran and with the Turkish President Erdogan. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in the West. The way it's been packaged by some media sources in the West is that Putin is isolated, so he's reaching out to the equally isolated Iranians because he needs some allies and he can't find major allies in other places. This is complete nonsense. It's bizarre, coming shortly after the BRICS summit meeting of a few weeks ago and the G20 summit meeting in Indonesia, when it became absolute, well, the preparatory summit meetings in Indonesia, when it became absolutely clear that the Russians are far from isolated. In fact, that sympathy in the global south is tilting towards them. But what makes these claims that I've been seeing in parts of the Western media, and indeed coming from the US government especially bizarre, is that, of course, one of the people whom Putin has had a meeting with in Tehran is President Erdogan of Turkey, who is, of course, nominally at least, a US ally, a NATO ally. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about this meeting as a meeting desperately sought by an isolated Vladimir Putin. But all of this, to my mind, tends to obscure the importance of what this summit meeting in Tehran is all about. Now, I've said that one of the important points of discussion that has happened over the course of this summit meeting is that, on the one hand, the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians have been wanting to reactivate their diplomatic work with a view to stabilizing the situation in Syria. The arrangement, that Iran, Russia, Turkey partnership, if you like, was originally created with a view to stabilizing the situation in Syria. And it's come with a particularly aggressive comment from President Erdogan, who says that the major reason that there is a terrorist crisis in Syria is because of the policies of the United States. Now, he's been particularly focusing on the Kurds. He regards, as the Turkish government does, he regards the various Kurdish groups that the United States is supporting in Syria as terrorist groups. This is what President Erdogan, how Erdogan defines them. But again, we see a NATO ally highly critical of US policy in discussions with the adversaries of the United States, Iran and Russia. And that really does again point to what an uncomfortable partner for the United States, President Erdogan and Turkey have become. But putting aside the discussions about Syria, it's the extent of the interaction between the Russians and the Iranians that ought to be the major cause of concern. And here, the most important news is that the Russians and the Iranians have agreed a major energy package. It seems that Gazprom, Russia's state-owned gas company, which produces most, though not all, of Russia's natural gas, and which is the monopoly exporter of Russian gas, it seems that it is Gazprom that's now going to work with Iran to develop Iran's natural gas fields, which, after Russia, are widely believed to be the second biggest in the world. And my impression is that the plan is that Iranian natural gas will be supplied not to Europe, which was, I suspect, the plan 10, 12 years ago. There was a lot of talk at that time about natural gas from Iran being piped to Europe to reduce European dependence on Russian natural gas. I'm going to come to all of that in a moment. But on the contrary, gas from Iran is going to flow east and the place it's going to flow towards is principally going to be India. So Russia will be focusing its natural gas exports on China. Iran will be focusing its natural gas exports to India, but will be doing it with Russian technical help. The Russians will develop the natural gas fields and will work with the Iranians to build the pipelines, which will presumably pass through Pakistan, or perhaps under the sea, or some other way. So that's the project, and it now explains a decision that Gazprom itself took a few weeks ago when they announced cancellation of the plan to build a Russian natural gas pipeline from Russia itself through Afghanistan and Pakistan to India. Gazprom said that this would not be an effective project, basically because of the instability of part of these regions. I think it's now clear that that project was cancelled in order to make it possible for Gazprom to move forward with Iran on this Iranian project instead. So it'll be Iranian gas will be flowing not to Europe but to Iran. And in fact, importantly, a short time ago, the Iranian foreign minister actually visited New Delhi, where he was received by no less a person than the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So we can see how all of this grid of connections is now being created. Pipelines from Russia to China to supply natural gas to China. China, this vast continental economy, it can absorb all of Russia's oil and it can absorb all of Russia's natural gas. And Iran, now drawn into the Eurasian system, it's about to join the BRICS as well. It's going to be partnering with Russia to supply its gas and perhaps ultimately its oil also to India, the other major country in the BRICS system. And Saudi Arabia looking to become possibly part of that system as well. Now that's only one of the major deals that has been done or sealed over the course of this Tehran summit meeting. Now in the past, I should say, there's actually been real problems, real obstacles establishing communications links between Iran and Russia. Iran and Russia have not always been friends, that's putting it mildly. During the Cold War, during the first part of the Cold War, whilst Iran was ruled by the former Shah, Iran was very, very much within the American camp. And even after the Iranian Revolution, relations between Iran and the Soviet Union and then Iran and Russia were often fairly tense, or at least there was a certain amount of suspicion. But over the last couple of years, those relations have got a great deal warmer. The new Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, seems determined to work towards anchoring Iran within the Eurasian system as a major player within that system. And what we now see is major efforts by Iran and Russia to perfect and develop their own communications links so that direct trade across the Caspian Sea and across Central Asia and Azerbaijan can now take place on a much more structured and connected basis. And the fact that Turkey is involved in these discussions suggests that sooner or later the Russians and the Iranians, who are now clearly part of this system, and the Indians, and of course above all the Chinese, are going to reach out to Turkey as well, and they're also going to draw Turkey into this Eurasian system too. I have to say that the contrast between the many deals that are being done, the way in which the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, the Chinese ultimately, the Indians too, are forging ahead with all these plans, does make an extraordinary contrast to the arid nullity which was Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia, which ended in tetchy interviews by Biden with members of the US media and without any real announcements or agreements being made. Now, I'm sorry to say that the fact that Iran is now becoming ever more closely integrated into the BRICS, I can't help but think is going to sour the mood among some people in Washington towards Iran even more, and I'm afraid that's going to heighten the risk of war between the United States and Iran, and between Israel, I suppose, and Iran too. But we can't be certain about how all of this is going to play out, and it's important to say that this time, if there is going to be a war between these countries and Iran, they need to understand that Iran this time will not be by itself, it will have friends. So that, I think, is how all of this is developing. And I'm beginning to get the sense that far from the Saudis welcoming this war, they're becoming increasingly concerned about it. I spoke in my recent program about how the opening of airspace, Saudi airspace, to commercial Israeli flights might be intended to make it easier for Israel to launch strikes against Iran. I think that is probably still the case, but the Saudis have gone out of their way in the last few days to downplay that idea, and to downplay the idea that Saudi Arabia is on the brink of establishing diplomatic negotiations with Israel. And the Saudis also are continuing to talk about the importance of improving their relations with Iran and of maintaining their relations with Russia. I can't help but think that there's some people in Saudi Arabia who are still very influential and who might, for all I know, still be the ascendant grouping within Saudi Arabia, who are worried that if there is a conflict between the United States and Iran on past history, what happened in Afghanistan being a good example, what will eventually happen is that there will be an open-ended conflict with Iran. Saudi Arabia will be under pressure to participate, and then at some point the United States will withdraw, and then Saudi Arabia will be left hanging out to dry. And I think there's some Saudis who are saying we mustn't get into that kind of situation. If the Israelis want to attack Iran, well, they can do it through our airspace, but we must under no circumstances become directly involved. So, and that may explain why the Saudis are cooling on the relationship with the US, and why they seem to themselves to be seeking reinsurance by looking to join the BRICS. Anyway, we shall see. Trying to work out what's going on in the Middle East is incredibly complicated. Diplomacy in the Middle East can be baffling in its intricacy, but that seems to me the most likely drift of Saudi policy, and I suspect that the anti-Iran bloc that Biden and his officials may have been seeking to create over the course of that trip to Saudi Arabia, they may be disappointed that it has not fully materialized. Anyway, there we are. Tensions still in the Gulf, but Iran now definitely tilting ever more closely towards the BRICS countries, towards the Eurasians, and forging ahead with close links closer links with Russia and ultimately with India and China, and with Turkey apparently also interested and also participating as well. So that's where we are on that stage of the diplomacy. Meanwhile, the situation in Europe is now becoming incredibly difficult. And here I've got to say that Putin has been playing his usual game of keeping everybody in suspense about what's going to happen with Nord Stream 2. So we get to hear from time to time that the Russians may be thinking about opening or reopening Nord Stream 1, I'm so sorry, I should make it clear, Nord Stream 1. And then we simultaneously hear that, in fact, the amount of gas that's going to be passing on to Europe, that may actually be reduced as well. So we see this constant game that Putin loves to play with the Europeans, keeping the Europeans in doubt and in suspense about what is going to happen. And at one and the same time, as all that is going on, the Russians simultaneously, as we've seen, are forging ahead with their reconnections with the eastern countries. But that in turn leaves the Western powers, the Europeans, very, very uncertain about their economic future. And their situation has obviously been made worse by the heat wave that's hit Western Europe, which has resulted in a major spike in energy consumption in Europe. There's been a despairing article in the Financial Times which says that the increase in this heat wave that they've been experiencing has meant that the European energy system is now buckling under the strain. It's finding it impossible to replace the Russian natural gas that is needed, and at the very time when the Europeans were hoping to build up their gas reserves ahead of the winter, they're finding it impossible to do so. On the contrary, those reserves are actually dwindling as they have to use more gas. And of course, we've just received further news that the situation with inflation in Europe has deteriorated, that the inflation rate is now 9.4%, actually higher than in the United States. And this is putting the European Central Bank in an increasingly difficult position. Does it raise interest rates? If so, by how much? What does it do to support countries like Italy? How does that work? How does it balance out with Germany and all these other countries? The Europeans are in a very difficult position. And I finally read some sustained criticism of the person who, in my opinion, is right at the centre of this whole issue, who is the economics minister, the German economics minister, Robert Habeck. And there's even been a comment by a German journalist that Habeck seems to be intent to do to Germany what the President Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary Morgenthau was seeking to do to Germany at the end of the Second World War, which is to say, to deindustrialize it utterly. Now, for the moment, Habeck's popularity has held up in Germany. In fact, the Greens have actually seen their popularity rise. But I suspect this is largely a product of the very favourable press that they've up to now been getting. I wonder whether the mood in Germany now is starting to shift, and whether as winter closes in, we're going to see a shift in mood in Germany to become more critical of Habeck and of the Greens. Well, we shall see. But regardless of that, it does look to me as if the Europeans are in for a particularly difficult time, and we will see how things turn out over the next few weeks. So there we go. Possible signs of a Ukrainian counteroffensive being imminent in southwest Ukraine. Definite signs of a Russian offensive in Donbass being prepared. Major deals being done in Iran between the Russians and the Iranians. Turkey also increasingly involved. A growing economic crisis in Europe. Certainly we do live in very interesting times. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in further programs for this channel. I'm glad to say that my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou is now back in action across all our platforms. And in the meantime, can I say that you can also find us on multiple other platforms, locals, our new Telegram channel, which is thriving, Rumble as well, which is of course connected to locals, ODYSEE too. And you can also find us on, and you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our polo shirts, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, and all those things. And in the meantime, thank you for joining me again. And if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. So that's the end of this video today. More from me soon.